Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, crowds chant anti-government slogans in protest over a huge hike in the price of fuel as Zimbabwe struggles with a shortage in foreign currency. Also, Ivorians are preparing to find out whether their former president, Laurent Gbagbo, will be acquitted of war crimes charges by the International Criminal Court. He's been in custody in The Hague for the last 7 years after around 3,000 people were killed during a post-electoral crisis in 2010 to 11. And schools and universities across Africa face a crisis. Private money is going somewhat to making up the gap in quality institutions, but at what cost? We hear from the CEO of one Pan-African university and ask him about the risks and potential rewards of setups like his. But first, riot police were out in force in Harare on Monday, and officers clashed with crowds in the second city of Bulawayo as anti-government protests broke out in response to a 150% hike in the price of fuel. The measure was introduced by President Emerson Mnangagwa over the weekend in response to the country's worst economic crisis in a decade. And Gainsford tells us more.
The Zimbabweans have had enough. They're taking to the streets to protest a recent hike in fuel prices. Angry at the economic crisis, they've blockaded roads into the capital, Harare.
It's about petrol. Someone just wakes up and decides to increase the fuel price. We're demanding that the price be reduced to its proper price.
This Saturday, the government announced it was going to raise the price of fuel by 150%. Many people are already struggling to make ends meet. Unemployment is over 80%, and the cost of living in Zimbabwe is spiraling.
Ordinary passengers are going to be affected very much. So ordinary citizens, ordinary workers, because sometimes your salary you'll be getting maybe just around 500. And then you have to spend $6 a day to travel from work to home and going back. So it's going to be a tough one for workers.
Cash shortages have plunged the economy into disarray, undermining President Mnangagwa's efforts to win back foreign investors. Zimbabwe abandoned its currency in 2009 after it was wrecked by hyperinflation, replacing it with greenbacks. The country now faces a shortage of US dollars. Inflation reached 31% in November, the highest it's been in a decade. Zimbabwe's finance minister says the country will introduce a new currency in the next 12 months. In an attempt to bring an end to the cash crisis.
In Ivory Coast, people across the political spectrum are preparing for the International Criminal Court's decision on the fate of former President Laurent Gbagbo and his minister Charles Blé Goudé. They're both on trial in The Hague for crimes against humanity linked to the post-electoral crisis of 2010 to 11. Gbagbo's been in custody for more than 7 years now, and there are calls for his acquittal. Judges are due to respond on Tuesday. A collapse in the case against Gbagbo, though, would deal a substantial blow to the ICC's reputation. Frank Hersey has more.
When rumour spreads like wildfire, on the 14th of December, word got around that Laurent Gbagbo had been released. His supporters gathered in neighbourhoods across Abidjan, such as here outside his house in Cocody. Whether or not the news was confirmed, the party was in full swing.
It's a real gift we're getting from Father Christmas this year.
Eventually, the rumour is extinguished, a symptom of the immense sense of injustice that Gbagbo's supporters feel 7 years into his trial. Here in Yopougon, a district with strong support for the former president, many will follow Tuesday's hearing with a strong sense of hope.
What Ivorians hope for this Tuesday is that President Laurent Gbagbo be purely and simply acquitted and that he'll return to Ivory Coast.
But such a view is far from universal.
We say no to freeing criminals, no to freeing murderers.
Surrounded by police, around 100 people gathered Monday morning to demand justice. They presented themselves as victims of the post-electoral crisis.
We want to officially tell the world that we are opposed to Laurent Gbagbo's release.
On the one side, the unconditional supporters of the former president. On the other, those who claim to be his victims. For this observer, it seems that the majority of Ivorians are not averse to Laurent Gbagbo being released.
The people of Ivory Coast on the whole, whatever their opinion, whether they're pro-President Ouattara, Gbagbo or Bidje, overall there's a desire to move on from the post-electoral crisis.
Even if Laurent Gbagbo were only granted provisional release while his case continues, it will still be a momentous day for Ivory Coast, much more so if he's acquitted. The country's holding its breath, as now with less than 2 years to go until the presidential election, either result could further upset the already rocky political status quo.
Cameroonian soldiers have reportedly destroyed a camp of secessionist fighters and recovered weapons and military uniforms. Troops claim to have killed 7 attackers during the reconnaissance mission near Bamenda on Sunday. The city's at the heart of over a year of increasing violence linked to an armed Anglophone secessionist bid in the country's English-speaking northwest and southwest regions. More than 200 members of the security forces and at least 500 civilians have been killed since October 2017. Now, improving education and access to education in Africa is crucial to stability and equitable growth on the continent. Currently, sub-Saharan Africa has the world's highest rate of out-of-school children and education exclusion. There are not enough quality institutions on offer to students who can consider higher education, and that's led to a greater reliance on private investment in African education. Now, that comes with its own set of opportunities and problems. In providing wider access to education, some private schools and universities have been accused of enabling governments to keep state education a low priority. Well, to speak more about this, we're joined by Luis Lopez, the CEO of Honoris, a pan-African network of universities. Luis, thanks very much for coming in to speak to us. Now, do you think that some of those criticisms levelled against private investment in education on the continent is fair? Do private universities, can they work alongside state-funded education? Do they encourage governments to make education of their people less of a priority?
There's 2 questions there, and I think into the first question, there's absolutely a need to have public and private coexist. But if you're going to do a good job of providing accessibility, the state cannot do it by itself. The state has responsibilities for health, it has responsibility for pensions, retirement, housing, and so the state needs partners. And therefore, private has to have a role. On the second piece, is there a likelihood that private could go astray if you don't have good rules, if you don't have clear rules, if you don't have enforcement? Yes, that can happen. And therefore, the responsibility of the state in a system that has to coexist is to provide good regulatory oversight, is to provide good rules and to provide oversight. So I do believe that private is absolutely necessary to provide accessibility. And I also think that in a good ecosystem, you do need rules for both public and private players that can be viewed and that can be enforced.
More widely across the continent, what do you think about the direction that education is going in at the moment? What are the holes that need to be filled in?
It varies by region. Africa is just a massive diversity of economies. From my perspective as a network, we have 32,000 students, we have 65,000 alum, we have 150 degree programs. The most important piece is to provide relevant skill sets to the youth. And that's for a high school leaver. We also have to retool working adults. And here at Honoris, what we do is have programs in health sciences, which is very career specific and reflects the needs of the continent. So health, engineering for infrastructure, business, law, IT, for services, as the economy is transformed from resource use to more services, you have to have a program offer, a portfolio where the students have employability at the end and a good return. So as a private player, I have to price my solution, I have to price my programs at a point level where the students and the families have a return.
In terms of pricing, who is going to universities? Is this? Do you think there's a risk that this is actually going to further entrench elitism in education on the continent?
I don't believe so. The fact of the matter is that when we choose to play in Tunisia, when we choose to play in Morocco, when we participate in South Africa, the first thing we do is say, what is the emerging middle class look like? And therefore, if you have a household budget that spends on housing, that spends on food, nourishment, the third most important item is education. And we are very measured about how we price our programs. And what does that mean, Georgia? It means that we also have payment plans. It means that you also have curricular maps, and you can have a 1-year certificate versus a 3-year program. So you have to provide a solution that is affordable with respect to price, with respect to consumption, with respect to use of technology if you can't come to the classroom, and that's how you provide access.
Africa currently, I believe, accounts for less than 1% of global research and development output. How do organizations like yours play a role in addressing this?
If you're going to have good research and development, you need the public system. That's the anchor. In the private sense, what we do is focus on areas that contribute to the economic growth. So in Morocco, we have a school called MC. MC is the best engineering school in the private space in Morocco. We do R&D there with respect to renewable energy, urban planning, consumption of fuels, and that's how we contribute. It's a very much an applied research versus a theoretical research.
You mentioned earlier the importance of working with local governments. Do you feel from your experience that African governments that you've worked with are genuinely making the education of their population a priority in terms of planning for national development?
I do believe so. I think the national development plans in the countries where we participate exist and they're being implemented. But to have a robust system in higher education, you need to have a robust investment and tracking in lower education, basic education. So the national development plans that we see and the markets that we participate in, the countries where we participate, have good investment in lower education, in languages, in math. You need to have basic language and you need to have basic math in order to even get to higher education.
Thanks very much. Luis Lopez there, the CEO of Honoris, a Pan-African network of universities. That is, though, unfortunately, where we're going to have to leave it for now for Eye on Africa. Thanks very much for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care. Thanks.
An exceptional sparkling wine, a symbol of celebration the world over. This week, France in Focus invites you to discover champagne. Don't miss it on France 24 and France24.com. 500,000 families evicted from their homes. 80% of construction firms bankrupt. Ghost towns. 30% unemployment. Public sector wages reduced and taxes increased. Spain, shortly after the economic crisis of 2008. Today, things look better, but what price has been paid?
We revisit Spain's economic crisis all this week on France 24.